Follow along, Catholic pilgrims, as we follow French doctor of the Church, St. Francis de Sales, through his book, Introduction to the Devout Life. Tune in as we read through this practical guide for living out the Catholic faith well. How is it going, Catholic pilgrims? I hope life is treating you well wherever you are in the world. Today, our reading is a continuation of last time, and to refresh, last time St. Francis was talking to us about living out the virtues, which is what he is going to be covering here in the third part. Today, he will be continuing on with the overview of the virtues, and so we won't see any particular virtue singled out for our practice. So let's get started by turning into our books to chapter 2 of the third part. Chapter 2, Choice of Virtues Continued. St. Augustine says well that when men are beginning to lead a devout life, they commit errors, which are, strictly speaking, against the laws of perfection, but which nevertheless are valuable as indications of future piety, to which they often conduce not a little. The low, groveling fear whence arises over scrupulousness in the minds of those who are but just forsaking sin is a quality not to be despised, inasmuch as it is the forerunner of future purity of conscience. But the same feeling would be blamable in those further advanced in holiness, whose hearts should be filled with love, which will gradually banish such servile fear. Originally, St. Bernard was exceedingly severe and rigorous towards those whom he directed, telling them when they came to him to leave their bodies and come with the Spirit only. Hearing their confession, he treated all, even the least fault, with such severity, and so pressed his poor novices in perfection, that instead of urging them forward, he kept them back. For they were dismayed and discouraged at being thus rudely driven up so steep and rugged a path. This was the result of the saint's own ardent zeal and great purity, and zeal is assuredly a virtue. Yet in this case it became an evil. But God vouchsafed to correct it, filling St. Bernard's heart with gentleness, tenderness, and mildness, so that changing his whole system, he reproached himself bitterly with his former exacting severity, and became so tender and forbearing that he was like St. Paul, all things to all men, that he might gain them all. St. Jerome records of his beloved daughter in the faith, St. Paula, that she not only was extravagant in her bodily mortifications, but also self-willed and persisting in them, contrary to the advice of St. Epiphanius, her bishop, and further, that at the death of those she loved, she indulged in such excessive grief as to endanger her own life. It will be said, he continues, that instead of praising this holy woman, I am condemning her, but I call Jesus, her master and mine, to witness that I speak the whole truth, both good and bad, representing her as she really was, according as one Christian should write of another. That is to say, I write her memoir, not her panegyric. And truly her faults would be another's virtues. That is to say, that St. Paula's faults and imperfections would have counted as virtues in one less holy. And indeed, there are many actions which we hold as imperfections in the perfect, which in the imperfect would pass for great virtues. It is a good sign when the legs of one recovering from sickness begin to swell, as denoting that reviving nature is throwing out what is corrupt in the system. But in a healthy man, it would be a bad sign, indicating that nature had not strength to absorb her own superfluities. Philothea, we must esteem highly those who abound in virtues, even though mingled with imperfections, remembering that so it has been with saints. But for ourselves, we must practice all virtues faithfully and watchfully, and give good heed to the wise man's counsel, and not rely on our own wisdom, but on that of the guides God has given us. There are some things which pass current as virtues, but are really quite otherwise, such as ecstasies, raptures, insensibilities, impassibilities, deific unions, elevations, transformations, and similar perfections, which are the subject of certain books. These promise to exalt the soul to a purely intellectual contemplation, to an essential application of the Spirit and a supereminent life. But these are not virtues. They are rather the reward of those virtues, or foretastes of the bliss of a future existence, which are sometimes granted to men in order to kindle their longings for the perfect blessedness of paradise. But it is safer not to seek such favors, which are in no ways necessary in order to serve and love God truly, which should be our only aim. Neither indeed can they be obtained by a labored search, since they are rather emotions than actions, which we can receive but not originate. Our aim is to become good, devout, pious men and women, and to that end we must labor. Then, if it should please God to give us angelic perfections, we should, doubtless, be good angels. But meanwhile, let us simply, humbly, and devoutly practice those lowly virtues, the acquisition of which has been appointed by our Savior as our daily task, such as patience, cheerfulness, a mortified heart, humility, obedience, poverty, chastity, kindness towards our neighbor, forbearance towards his faults, diligence, and holy fervor. Let us cheerfully leave preeminent graces to preeminent souls. We do not deserve so high a post in God's service. Too happy if we can obtain the humblest office in his household, whence he, in his own good time, if he sees fit, will bid us come up higher. Yes, Philothea, this glorious king does not reward his servants according to the dignity of their office, but according to the humility and love with which they fulfilled that appointed them. Whilst Saul sought his father's asses, he found the kingdom of Israel. Rebekah, whilst watering Abraham's camels, became his son's bride. Ruth, gleaning after the reapers and lying at Boaz's feet, was raised up to be his wife. Undoubtedly, high pretensions are very liable to illusions, deceits, and errors, so that sometimes those who would fain be angels are not really even good men, and there is more of elevation and holiness in their words and expressions than in their heart and deeds. Nevertheless, we should never be hasty with our contempt or censure, but whilst we thank God for the exalted favors he bestows on others, remain humbly in our own lower sphere, lower indeed, but safer and better, more suited to our weakness and insufficiency, certain that if we walk therein humbly and faithfully, God will exalt us to real greatness. I used to live in Las Vegas, which is a weird place to live. And the entire time I lived there, I gambled once with $1 my daughter gave me on my birthday, and I won 2 back, and that was it for me. Gambling is not evil in and of itself, but it definitely can lead into sin through greed, recklessness, and just a lot of the activities that surround it. And gambling is not something I'm tempted in any way, not even a smidge. And so I find that I have little tolerance for those who do struggle with it. It's not something I can relate to, and so there have been times when my judgment of people who do struggle with gambling has been very severe. And what happens is I deem myself virtuous because I don't struggle with that particular sin. And yet the way that I think about those that do can be very sinful and unhelpful. St. Francis gives us the example of St. Bernard being, quote, exceedingly severe and rigorous towards those whom he directed, telling them when they came to him to leave their bodies and come with the spirit only. Hearing their confession, he treated all, even the least fault, with such severity and so pressed his poor novices in perfection that instead of urging them forward, he kept them back, for they were dismayed and discouraged at being thus rudely driven up so steep and rugged a path. Unquote. I can relate to St. Bernard. I'm a very black and white person, and when I decide to either do something or not do something, like, that's it for me. I don't really have a problem stopping or starting. And with me, what is wrong and what is right, and I have little patience for those that maybe need a gentler approach. And this is something that we don't want to do, to ourselves and to others. We don't want to dissuade people or so burden them or ourselves in pursuit of holiness. And we don't want to demand perfection from the get-go and not have any mercy at all. Thankfully, quote, God vouchsafed to correct St. Bernard, filling his heart with gentleness, tenderness, and mildness, so that changing his whole system, he reproached himself bitterly with his former exacting severity and became so tender and forbearing that he was like St. Paul, all things to all men, that he might gain them all, unquote. We're getting ready to read about the virtues and how to go about practicing them in this third part. And as we strive to practice the virtues and we listen to St. Francis, let's remember to have patience with ourselves and patience with others, leading them and ourselves, not severely, but firmly and gently. That is all for today, Catholic Pilgrims. Next up is the virtue of patience. And until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.